Shauna. Thank you, Pastor Patina. So, Shauna has served us all through, we went through all the COVID days when we were just completely virtual. And by the way, we're glad you're here if you're worshiping with us by live stream. But as you might have noticed, she's expecting. And we're praying for her because she's expecting the day after Easter. Day before Easter. So, but man, she serves us so well with her gifts. So it's cold outside, and go ahead and get all of your Mr. Rogers jokes out. People all through the morning have been talking to me about my sweater, so I get it. I got it. The weather does impact sometimes how we do church, and I heard about a pastor who woke up in the morning and just drifts of snow everywhere. The wind was blowing and whipping all the snow around. And Sunday morning, he's like, should I even go to church? Nobody's going to come. He's like, I got to go. I've got to show up. So he goes to the church and he gets the lights on. He gets the furnace going. And time for the service gets closer and closer, and nobody's coming. Just a couple minutes before the time to start, this old farmer comes in through the door, and he, kicks the snow off of his boots and comes down front and sits down in the pew, and the pastor goes over to him. He says, "Listen, I've never had this happen before. It's just you and I. I don't really know what to do." And the farmer said, "Well, Pastor, I'm a farmer. When my cattle come to eat, I feed them." Pastor said, "You are right." He says, "Sit down there." So the man sat back down, and they sang the hymns. They did the responsive reading. They did the prayer. The message was given. He went to the back and stood there waiting to shake hands, and the old farmer came, and he said, "Pastor, I guess I should have mentioned that when the cows come, if it's only one, I don't feed them the whole load." Well, you're getting a whole load today. You're getting everything I got, so we're glad that you're here. We've been doing this series called Reconstruction Zone, and we've been using the story from the Old Testament book of Nehemiah to walk through this reconstruction project. Just a little review. Nehemiah was an exile from his Jewish homeland, found himself living in the house of the king of Persia, and he was the wine taster for the king. It was a job of a lot of import. It was a great position for him, and yet God calls him out of that to oversee this reconstruction project of the gates and the walls of Jerusalem. Now, as part of this series a few weeks ago, I talked about how that group of people worked side by side, and as they worked side by side together, they functioned some ways dependently, but also independently, but also interdependently. And how in some ways the parts of the human body are like that, with each person playing a part. And so this past week we were trying to figure out how to illustrate that. And so when I tell you that Damian Harrington has a twisted mind, now you'll know what I'm talking about. Somehow he came up with the idea. We were sitting there, and for about 30 minutes, we're just bouncing it around the room, and then Damien says, "Well, we ought to build a DNA model." And I think he meant here on the altar, but there turned into there. And I want to thank Damien and Carl Klein and Frank Wales, because they made all that happen. So you can. Guilty pleasure. I almost texted Damien on Thursday night after he'd finished this and said, "Oh, I decided to go a different direction with the sermon." So we have this incredible 13 by 5 foot DNA double helix. And why? Well, last weekend, Pastor Patina talked about how there are external attacks. That when we begin to answer the call of God on our lives, and we begin to live into what we hear God calling us to do or to be, that attacks will come. Things will come at us from the outside. And if you remember, she had this huge pile of blocks up here, and they were all independent of each other, just kind of sitting there. Well, this morning, I want to talk about the church, and I want to use the image of the body like I did a few weeks ago. But I want to talk about how what happens inside of us can impact us in such a way that it leaves us just in that kind of that random pile with no sense of what it means to be a body together. So let me offer up a prayer before we do that together. Let's pray. As ever, God, when one of your servants stands to speak the loudest and the clearest to that servant. Amen. So I want to talk about, Pastor Bettina talked about external attacks. I want to talk about internal attacks. Because up until this point in the story of Nehemiah, no matter what has been tried externally, the project has continued on. Nothing has derailed it from outside forces. But what we find out today when we get to chapter 5, that there's something internal that threatens this whole massive reconstruction project. You see, it isn't foreign invaders. It isn't the attitude of the people of Jerusalem. It's not that they feel bad about themselves, that they don't think they're worthy of having a wall that protects them or gates that function. It isn't even the threat of the complaints from the non-Jewish governors that Pastor Bettina talked about last week, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. What really threatens this project, we discover in chapter 5, is something from inside of them, inside their own walls, among their own people. Now, Bill read it a moment ago, but I want to read it to you again. The first 5 verses of chapter 5, it says, "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, 'We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and to stay alive, we must get grain.' And others were saying, 'We're mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our homes to get grain during this famine.' Still others were saying, 'We have to borrow money to pay the king's taxes on our fields and our vineyards. And although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and although our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved. We are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others.'" That's the definition of an internal attack. Now, when it comes to the church, one of my favorite writers is a guy named Pastor Warren Wiersbe, and he wrote about the attacks that come inside of the body of Christ, the church. And Wiersbe says this, he says, "When the enemy fails in his attacks from the outside, he then begins to attack from within. And one of his favorite weapons is selfishness. If he can get us thinking only about ourselves and what we want, then he will win the victory before we realize that he's even at work." Well, what's occurred is that some of these Jewish leaders, rather than lead the people, have taken this famine as an opportunity to get something from the people. There are some workers who have no land to grow crops, and so they're forced to buy food that they can't afford, but they have to pay for it so that their families don't starve. And others who are workers on this project, who've come from the outside, they are farmers, they have land, but because they've dedicated themselves to the rebuilding project of the walls and the gates, in order for their farms to continue to function, their wives and their sons and their daughters have had to become farmers in their place. On top of that, the king of Persia has continued to require them to pay their taxes. So they're unable to work, unable to meet the rising prices. Their bills are mounting. The situation sounds really bad. And the leaders of the community, the nobles, step in, as they should. But they don't step in to offer real help. What they do is they step in and they begin to loan money, but they do it at exorbitant costs. Instead of helping, they charge high interest rates, and they even demand that as collateral for the loans, they offer up their farms and sometimes even their children. It was exploitation, and they were doing it in the name of help. But it was really all about profiting from the misery of another, and it was all happening within the walls that they were trying to rebuild. Everything that they've been working towards is now at risk because of this toxic, negative, and greedy behavior within the body. The only bright spot in this whole story is that if you've been reading along chapter by chapter, you know that they have an exceptional and a godly leader in Nehemiah. Nehemiah sees that even though his project, the walls and the gates, even though that project is going fine, there's something that is not right and can't continue. There's something dying inside of the very walls that he's trying to rebuild. And Nehemiah sees that people cannot rebuild anything on the outside when they're being torn down from the inside. So what does a godly leader do when faced with that kind of issue? Well, he does what all of us do. He has an internal response. In verse 6, we're told that Nehemiah said, "When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry." Say that with me. I was very angry. Anybody ever been angry? Of course we have, right? Everybody gets angry. But this isn't the kind of angry where somebody in your family lost the remote control. So you guys are stuck watching Lifetime channel, over and over. This is righteous anger. This is the anger that comes when we see someone damaging another, when we see the mercy and the love of God being withheld from one because of the intentional choices of another. Righteous anger, godly anger. The kind of anger that bubbles up inside of us when we see someone being harmed. Nehemiah got righteously angry. And yet, in the midst of his anger, he makes a choice, a mature choice. He chooses not to allow his internal anger to become externally destructive. Now, how does he do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because we go from verse 6, when he's angry, to verse 7. It says, "I pondered them in my mind." In other words, he pictured what these nobles were doing to his people, and he took the time to step back and think about the implications of it. He took the time to ponder what he should do, how he should channel the anger that was boiling up inside of him. And he knew that the goal of allowing his anger to become something redemptive rather than something destructive was the godly thing to do. You see, Nehemiah had a goal of having the unhealthy situation to become healthy. He wanted the body to get well on the inside so that everything could flourish on the outside. Nehemiah spends time praying over the situation. He takes counsel, I'm sure from the Holy Spirit. He thought over what his response should be. I got to tell you, I don't always take that route when I'm angry. I'm sure all of you do, right? You see, church, when Nehemiah takes that time to step back and to ponder and to allow God to work within him, something powerful and godly happens. Something in the mind and the heart of Nehemiah allows for the possibility of redemption rather than destruction. He's able to offer a prescription for the situation rather than a disaster. So let me share with you something that may seem like a detour, but it's not. God was growing something within this Jewish body of people to fight off the threat of what had begun to destroy them from within. Just like God creates things within the human body to fight off the things that try to keep us from being fully healthy. Did you know that in your body there are 37 trillion cells? I didn't know that. I Googled it, but I looked at about 5 different places. So 37 trillion's kind of the common number. And each of those cells is made up of DNA molecules. And in each of these DNA molecules, there are things that are happening. In that molecule, there are strands. And each of those strands are receiving messages and codes that help them to determine how they're supposed to function correctly and to keep themselves healthy. So there's this healthy thing going on. But at the same time, in the same body, your body, 1 billion cells die every day. Did you know that? That right now there's 1 billion things in your body that are dying. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Now, why have I told you all this? 37 trillion, 1 billion. Well, science has discovered that in order for this to be healthy, that which is dead cannot continue to stay there. If dead cells are permitted to hang around, the body becomes toxic to itself. The dead and the inactive cells begin to damage and weaken other cells and can eventually kill the entire body. It has to deal with its own toxicity. It has to handle and manage the illness, the rebellion, the human body does to itself. But an amazing God has actually created something within us, special cells, that are called macrophages. So I want you to listen to the definition of a macrophage. And if you were here last week, Pastor Patina talked about the workers who stood on the wall and they participated in the rebuilding project, but at the same time, they acted as lookouts, as sentinels for anything that would come and attack externally. Listen to the definition of a macrophage. Macrophages are key components of the innate immune system that reside in tissues, where they function as immune sentinels, lookouts. They are uniquely equipped to sense and respond to tissue invasion by infectious microorganisms and tissue injury through various scavenger pattern recognition. In other words, inside your body all the time, there are these molecules that are looking, sensing, keeping watch to see if there's anything within the body that has become toxic, unhealthy, inactive, and they deal with it. They either code it differently so that it becomes healthy, or they get rid of it. They act upon the messaging that they see happening, and anything that sends the wrong kind of message to the body, they don't allow it to stay. Nehemiah was a macrophage for the Jewish people. He looked at everything that was toxic and unhealthy, and he stepped in. He uses his head, his heart, and his voice, and he allowed his thoughts and his words to deal with and guide those selfish leaders. He is for them a spiritual macrophage. You see, Nehemiah decides, I'm going to call everybody together because my goal was redemption. And so he calls everybody together because he wants everyone to hear or to overhear the conversation he's about to have. And he pulls these nobles in, and the first thing he does is he tries to appeal to their national pride. He reminds them, guys, we've been trying to buy back our own people from other nations and bring them here. And at the same time, we're mistreating those that are already here. Just a little aside, how often does that happen in churches? We spend all of our time talking about how do we get more people here? How can we attract more people? How can we get more people to want to be here? And yet we treat each other in ways that people outside go, why would I ever want to be a part of that? You can't pray for people to come from outside of us when you mistreat the people inside of us. It just doesn't make sense. So he appeals to their national pride, how they're treating one another. Then he appeals to their conscience, to the spirit within them. He says, we are God's people. Shouldn't we be walking before the Lord in ways that we wouldn't be ashamed of? So after he appeals to their pride and then to their conscience, he says, listen, my brothers and I, we've been convicted. So we're loaning just like you are, except we're not charging interest. We're offering real help because there are real people who are really hurting. And finally, he gets to verse 11, and he offers them a prescription. He says, this is what ought to happen. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you're charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. In other words, don't just make them whole, give them something more. Help them to be well. See, church, that is how mature bodies are called to function. From the head to the hands to the heart, from the head to the rest of the body. Nehemiah is angry, but he's also wise, and so his anger becomes redemptive rather than destructive. He wants these leaders to be called out, but not for the purpose of just calling them out. His hope is that in the midst of the condemnation, they'll find resurrection, redemption, wholeness. Now, Nehemiah has to rely on God to soften their hearts, because hard hearts may hear what you say, but they won't be transformed by it. Nehemiah knows that he needs to speak the truth, but only God can soften their hearts and help them not just to hear it, but to process it and to begin to live it out. So in verse 12, we hear the nobles give their external response. And what happens is that they receive what I'm calling a spiritual laminin. And I'm going to explain what laminin is in just a moment. But listen to what is said in verse 12. We will restore these and require nothing from them. We will do as you say. In other words, we're going to take the medicine. We're going to do what's necessary to get well. We're going to participate in the health of this body. They may have been hard-headed, they may have been greedy, but in that moment, they chose to become something different. They allowed themselves to be transformed. They allowed themselves to begin to participate in the wellness of everything that they were a part of, or could be a part of. So church, that leads me to ask you this question, because we have exactly the same choice to make as the body of Christ. what will our church be? What will our choice as a church be? Will we be healthy or will we be toxic? You know, I've been working not just as a pastor, but I've been on staff at churches now for over 40 years. And when I look around the church today, I got to tell you, there is an awful lot that passes for church in this world today that is toxic and unhealthy and even ungodly. And I say that because I see it all around me, but I also say that because there are times when I see it in me. It comes in all sorts of forms, but the illness itself is really spiritual immaturity. We just don't want badly, deeply, to grow in our faith. We don't do the things that help us to grow in our belief. Now, that's the diagnosis, but there are a whole lot of symptoms. Things like spiritual laziness. And spiritual laziness leads to all sorts of behaviors: gossip, selfishness, judgmentalism, negativity, laziness, inactivity, a lack of personal holiness, a lack of generosity, a lack of servant heart. And I could go on and on and on. You see, the diagnosis is that too often we who are inside the body damage the very body we are a part of. An unhealthy inside gets discovered as unhealthy outside. The goal for us is to be as beautiful inside this building as it is outside when people drive past it. So beautiful in here that it's not enough for them to just drive past it. They've got to see what's going on inside of it. But church, we have to decide. As God's people, we have to decide who will guide us in that process. Who will lead us? What message will we hear? What message will be stamped upon us that we will live out? Because the truth is that we cannot get ourselves healthy on our own. We will never behave ourselves into health as the church. I'm not capable, you're not capable. You say, well, that sounds pretty helpless, pretty hopeless. No, there is all sorts of reasons to be hopeful because there is something bigger than us, beyond us, that can heal us. Something inside of us that's bigger than us that can make us all that we can be. So I want to show you something that's way down deep inside of every human body, a single element within our DNA that can create the healthy function that God intended when He made your body and my body. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about laminin. Laminin is the single element within the DNA of our body that tells everything else in our body how to function. If your body is doing something right, it's because it's listening to the laminin. If your body, as you sit here right now, if your skin is working to hold your intestines in so that you're not leaking out all over the pew, that's a beautiful image, isn't it? Then laminin's working, and your body's listening to it. If your body right now, if your cells are not turning corrosive and cancerous, it's because it's listening to the laminin that's within your body. If you're looking at me right now and the rods and the cones in your eyes are receiving the message and flipping it, and you can actually see me for the dashing and handsome man that I am, that means that laminin's working. Listen to the definition for laminin. Laminin creates a mechanical scaffold that sends biological information that triggers and controls cellular functions. Laminin sends the message. This is who we are. This is how we live. This is why we're healthy. So let me show you what laminin looks like. Here's a model of laminin. Wow, that shape looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? I've seen that before somewhere. You say, well, that's just a model. You can draw a model any way you want. Well, let's look at a picture of it in an electron microscope, actual laminin. You say, so Pastor, you're telling me that you choose to believe that somehow God has put some cross-shaped element within my body that signals the rest of my body how to live? You're going to believe in that slender a thread? You're absolutely right, I am. Because our God is not a God of coincidence. There is something cross-shaped inside of my body that tells me how it's supposed to live. And the same needs to be true for this body as well. Listen to what it said in Colossians chapter 1. And while I'm reading this, take a look, keep looking at those images. It says, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, this is my favorite part, and in him all things hold together. Jesus Christ is the spiritual laminin for this body, or he should be. We were meant to function together as a body. We were meant to operate in ways that are truthful and helpful and healing and healthy. That's one of the reasons why we talk so much around here about serving, because when I serve, I get my focus off of myself and on to what's going on in the lives of others. Not to mind their business, but to be involved in making their life all that it can be. Because the more everyone else's life is all that it can be, the more than my life will be all that it can be. You see, this model that those guys made for us, if you take the time to walk around it, every one of you that wrote on one of those blocks, your block is either somewhere in this model or somewhere in that wall. Because when you heard the invitation from God to come and be a part of these people, this place, your time, your talent, your treasure, your family became a part of something bigger than yourself. At this church, you heard an invitation that goes back generations. 150 years, God has been inviting people to be a part of something bigger than themselves. But it goes back even further than that. The invitation that you've heard to come and be a part of the body, it's the same invitation that the apostles had. Their invitation to walk with Jesus and to follow him is your invitation to walk with Jesus and follow him as well. We're the building blocks of something much bigger than ourselves. So last week, this was a handout in the bulletin there at every door now, because we want to help. We want to help you in your life of serving God by serving others. We mentioned on the back here, there's a spiritual gifts test that you can take. It won't take much time at all. It can help guide you. Nothing miraculous about this, but it can help guide you into some right paths where you might find joy in serving. Now, when you fill out this test, it's going to send you an email of your results, but it also gives you the opportunity to send it to somebody else. And we want to ask you to send that to, you can always send it to myself or Pastor Patino, but Jim Besh is the one that's really helping us to get people to find places to serve that are going to be meaningful for them. So Jim's available if you head through these back doors here to the lobby area. There's a table out there called a yes table. Jim's there. He can answer any questions that you have, whether it's about this area of interest survey or the spiritual gifts test that is available online. You say, well, Pastor Brian, Pastor Patina, I hear that you want me to do this, but I want to start right away. I'm going to do these other things because you're the pastor and, we're going to follow your lead. But on the back of your bulletin, if you want to know what can you do tomorrow, these are the most immediate things that our church is dealing with right now. Places where we're trying to get healthy, places where we're trying to get well, places where we just want to be all that we can be. So Jim can talk to you about those as well. You can call the church office. And I want you to understand that churches that are doing this for the right reason, churches that are talking to people about serving for the right reasons, aren't just trying to fill up people's lives with busy stuff. You've already got lives full of busy stuff. What we're trying to do is offer you the opportunity to find blessing and wholeness by helping other people find blessing and wholeness. Because when we find blessing and wholeness, our lives can be transformed. Because there's really only one laminin that guides the DNA of this church. And that's the truth.